My mom cried last night. The entire table went silent. Jaehyun looked down slowly. A 4-year-old girl. Red hoodie. Standing inches from the most dangerous hand in the room. Fingers twisting the torn hem of her shirt. She hadn't made a sound walking in. Nobody had heard her coming. Behind Jaehyun, 3 bodyguards reached for their holsters simultaneously. 2 lieutenants were already on their feet. 1 finger, just one raised slowly from the table. Every man in the room sat back down. He studied her. The bistro had gone completely tomb silent. Even the kitchen noise seemed to stop. She thought I was sleeping, but I wasn't. She kept saying, "Mr. Sterling, please," but nobody was there. Jaehyun set his glass down. The ice didn't even clink. He looked at the little girl for a long moment. At the red hoodie. At the fingers still twisting the hem of her shirt. At the eyes that were looking at him the way people looked at monuments. Uncertain if he was real, but having come too far to turn back. "You talking to me?" he asked quietly. "Yes." "You sure about that?" She looked around the room once at the hard faces, the broad shoulders, the hands that had just been reaching for things children shouldn't know exist. Then she looked back at him. "You're the only one nobody's laughing around," she said. "My mom says that's what a real boss looks like." Jaehyun's gaze moved slowly across the bistro floor. Sterling was at the far end of the bar, loudly dangling a fresh set of leather Porsche keys in front of a laughing woman. Gold watch catching the light. Not a worry in the world. Jaehyun looked back at the girl. "What's your name?" "Royale." Something moved behind his eyes. Brief. Private. "Royale," he repeated. "How old are you?" 4.5. She said the half like she had earned it. "Who brought you here today?" "My mom." "She know you're standing here?" Royale hesitated. Just half a second. "She thinks I'm in the bathroom." The man to Jaehyun's left exhaled. Not quite a laugh. Close enough. Jaehyun silenced him with a look. He turned back to Royale. "You walked past 6 men to get to this table. You know that?" "I counted 7, she said. Nobody laughed because nobody knew if they were supposed to. Jaehyun reached forward and moved the glass in front of him to the side, clearing the space between them. A small gesture. In his world it meant something. It meant he was listening. "Tell me about your mother," he said. "Her name is Simone," Royale said. "And Mr. Sterling got a new car. But my mom says we can't eat out anymore." She reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It had been folded and unfolded so many times, the creases had gone soft. She smoothed it carefully on the table with both palms the way a child handles something precious and turned it to face him. A handwritten log. Dates down the left side. Hours on the right. Every single day filled in with the same careful handwriting. Some entries had small stars beside them. Jaehyun looked at it without touching it. "She wrote this?" "I helped with the stars," Royale said. "Those are the days she worked double. She didn't want to write them down because she said Mr. Sterling would say she was lying. So I put stars so we would remember." Jaehyun's jaw tightened. He looked at the bottom of the page. The total was circled twice. $5,400. Beside it, in smaller writing, someone had added, "He said he would pay. He said next week. He said next week again." "She wrote that part herself," Royale said quietly. "Late at night when she thought I was sleeping." Jaehyun said nothing. 11 weeks, Royale said. "But yesterday he bought a Porsche." Jaehyun folded his hands on the table. His rings caught the low light. Heavy. Cold. The kind of jewelry worn not for decoration but for history. "And you came to this table to tell me that. You're the only one who looks strong enough to bring the light back," she said simply. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached forward and picked up the wage log carefully. Folded it once. Placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket like evidence. Like something he intended to use. "Royale," he said. She looked up at him. "Go back to the bathroom. Wash your hands. Walk back to where your mother can see you." She frowned slightly. "Are you going to help?" He straightened his cuff. "Once. Go wash your hands." She studied him for one more second, 4.5 years old, reading a Mafia boss like a picture book. Then she folded her paper napkin neatly on the table, slid off the chair, and walked back through the bistro the same way she came. Nobody stopped her. Nobody even breathed. At the bar, Sterling's keys were still spinning on his finger. Jaehyun didn't move for a long time after Royale walked away. He sat exactly as he had been sitting, one arm resting on the table, the other draped over the back of his chair, but the meeting was over. The men around him understood this without being told. Phones went face down, folders closed, glasses were set down carefully, without sound. Nobody spoke, and nobody asked why, because the men who worked for Shin Jae-hyun had learned early that silence wasn't absence, it was instruction. They had seen this before, the stillness that came before something irreversible. His eyes moved across the bistro floor. Not obviously, never obviously, but tracking. moving between tables with the patient efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years learning that the most important information in any room was never the information people were trying to show you. It was everything else. The peripheral, the overlooked, the thing happening in the corner while everyone watched the center. He found her without searching. Simone. She was moving between tables near the far window, carrying a full tray with both hands, black apron tied at her waist, gray shirt beneath it, slightly damp at the collar from the kitchen heat. Her hair had been pulled back tight at the start of her shift. He could tell by the tension still visible at her temples, but several strands had worked themselves free, and she hadn't had a moment to fix them. She redistributed the tray's weight every few steps, left to right. A small automatic correction she probably didn't notice herself doing anymore. Her left side. Something wrong with her left side, that she had learned to work around so completely it had become invisible to her. He noticed it. She reached table 4 and set 2 plates down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Before the customers could ask, she was already checking the next table, refilling a water glass, removing an empty bread basket, straightening a fork that had slipped to the wrong side of the plate. Small, unnecessary kindnesses that nobody had asked for and nobody acknowledged. She turned back toward the kitchen. She hadn't stopped once since he'd been watching. Then Sterling's voice cut across the bistro, loud, performative, shaped for an audience. Simone. She stopped, turned. Table 6 has been waiting 8 minutes. He was leaning against the host stand with his phone in one hand and his Porsche keys in the other, speaking to her the way people spoke to furniture without looking directly at it. 8 minutes is embarrassing. I'm sorry, she said. Her voice was even, controlled. I was just finishing table 4. I'll go right now. I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm telling you table 6 has been waiting. He turned back to his phone. Simone turned back toward the kitchen. Her shoulders didn't drop. She didn't let them. Her pace didn't slow. She didn't press her lips together or blink too many times, or do any of the small visible things people did when they were absorbing something they couldn't respond to. She had too much discipline for that, and too much experience with the particular type of humiliation that had an audience. But Jae-hyun had been reading people for 20 years. He saw what she was swallowing. He looked back across the bistro floor. Royale was near the kitchen hallway, standing exactly where he had told her to stand, where her mother could see her. She wasn't watching Sterling. She was watching Jae-hyun with those quiet, precise eyes, waiting, patient and still as a small general monitoring a battlefield she had already mapped before anyone else arrived. She had planned this, he realized, not the way adults planned things with contingencies, with exit strategies, with calculated risk assessment. The way children plan things, with complete and total faith that if you identified the right person and told them the truth, something would happen. He looked away before she could see him looking. He reached into his jacket and opened a contact with no name saved against it. Just a number. Typed 4 words. I need the file. 3 seconds. The reply came back. Which one? Jae-hyun's eyes moved across the bistro to Sterling, who was now showing his Porsche keys to the woman at the bar, holding them up so the light caught the logo, laughing at something she said. A man performing prosperity. A man who had bought a car while a woman's electricity was cut off and felt nothing about the distance between those two facts. He typed back, the one that ends him. He set the phone face down on the table. The ice in his glass had been melting for 40 minutes, and the drink was cold water now, but he didn't call for another. He wanted to sit exactly here and watch exactly this room until Park arrived and the pieces were in position, and everything that happened next happened the way he intended it to happen. Surgical, he thought. It had to be surgical. Sterling had a liquor license, a health inspection record, a relationship with a city councilman whose name appeared twice in a financial file Jae-hyun hadn't fully read yet. A man like that had tripwires everywhere. Pull the wrong one and the explosion drew attention his syndicate could not afford right now. It had to be clean. It had to be complete. It had to leave Sterling with nothing to rebuild from, and no one to complain to, and no version of tomorrow in which he was still relevant to Simone's life, in any capacity whatsoever. Across the bistro, Simone came back out of the kitchen, carrying a fresh bread basket for table 6. She set it down, smiled at the customer, moved to the next table before anyone could see her exhale. Jae-hyun watched her for a long moment. 11 weeks, he thought. Every single day. He put the phone back in his pocket. The file arrived 11 minutes later, not through the door, not carried by anyone visible. It arrived the way all of Jae-hyun's most important information arrived silently, directly to his phone, from a man whose name existed nowhere in any system, and who had never once been in the same room as anyone Jae-hyun was about to destroy. Jae-hyun opened it without changing his expression. Sterling, David A., 43 years old, date of birth, blood type, The kind of comprehensive opening that told you immediately this wasn't a surface search. This was the kind of file that took infrastructure to build. 3 addresses listed in order, the apartment he declared on his taxes, the one he actually slept in 4 nights out of 7, and a third property registered under a company name that traced back to a woman who had signed a single document 8 years ago and never appeared in any paperwork again. He scrolled past the property records, past the business registration, past the health inspection violations that had been quietly resolved twice through channels that didn't involve actual improvements to the kitchen, past the names of 2 previous employees who had filed labor complaints in the last 4 years, both complaints dismissed. One woman had withdrawn hers after receiving a cash payment that appeared nowhere in Sterling's declared expenses. The other had simply stopped responding to the labor board's correspondence 6 weeks after filing, around the same time she moved to a different city entirely. Jae-hyun read that entry twice. Then he moved on. The bistro was doing well. Not exceptionally, Sterling wasn't talented enough for exceptional, and the bistro wasn't located well enough for exceptional, but consistently. The kind of numbers that meant a careful owner could sleep at night, pay his staff properly, maintain his equipment, and still have enough left over for a reasonable life. Sterling was not a careful owner. The declared revenue was accurate enough. It was the expenses column that told the real story, the inflated supplier costs, the ghost maintenance contracts, the payroll entries that didn't match the actual hours worked by actual people. The financial equivalent of a man rearranging furniture to hide a stain in the floor. Functional if nobody looked directly at it. Catastrophic if someone did. Someone was looking directly at it now. Below the financials, separated by a single red line, his contact used only when something required immediate attention, was the gambling ledger, offshore account. 3 years of entries. The losses were not the problem. The amounts were. The ledger had crossed into the territory where the people on the other side stopped being patient automatically and started requiring convincing to remain patient. And Sterling, based on the final 3 months of entries, had stopped being convincing. Jae-hyun locked his phone, set it face down on the table, and returned his attention to the bistro floor. Simone was at the far counter waiting on an order. She stood with her weight shifted slightly to her right, the left side compensation. So habitual now it had become her natural resting position. While she waited, she wiped down a section of counter that was already clean, not because it needed it. Because her hands needed something to do, and standing still in this bistro had a cost she had learned to minimize by staying in motion. She was efficient in the way people became efficient, when efficiency was the only thing standing between them and chaos. Every movement deliberate, nothing wasted. She had internalized the geometry of this bistro so completely, the tight corners, the tables that were too close, the chair that stuck out at table 9, the loose floor tile near the kitchen entrance that caught heels, that she navigated all of it without conscious thought. She had given this place 10,000 hours. Sterling had given her 11 weeks of excuses in return. Her order came up. She loaded the tray 4 items, balanced precisely, and turned back toward the floor. She was halfway to her table when the man at the aisle seat pushed his chair back without looking. Simply pushed it back the way people pushed chairs back when they had never once had to be careful about the space they occupied. The tray lurched hard to the left. Jae-hyun's hand moved on the table 1 inch, involuntary before Simone caught it. Both hands snapping to the tray edges with a speed that came from having dropped things before and having learned the exact cost of dropping them here. 3 items held. The 4th rocked twice and settled. She stood completely still for 1 second. Just one. Then she set the tray down, arranged the items on the table, smiled at the customers, collected the empty glasses, and moved back toward the counter. The man who pushed his chair back was already looking at his phone. Behind the host stand, Sterling glanced over. He watched Simone catch the tray, watched her recover, watched her smile at the table like nothing had happened. And then, slowly, without bothering to disguise it, he smiled. The particular private smile of a man who found other people's near disasters faintly amusing. A smile with no audience because it wasn't performed. It was just what his face did. Then he looked back at his phone. Jae-hyun looked at that smile for a long time after it faded. He thought about surgical. He thought about clean. He thought about complete. Then he thought about a rainy night 12 years ago, and reached into his jacket and removed the wage log. Held it for a moment, the soft creased paper, the careful handwriting, the stars Royale had drawn on the double shift days. Put it back. Picked up his lighter. Turned it once in his hand. Park would be here in 4 minutes. It wasn't the file that pulled him under. It wasn't even Simone's name, though, that had cracked something open the moment Royale said it. Something he hadn't examined yet, because examining it here, in this room, with these people watching him, was not something he was prepared to do. He had filed it the way he filed everything that required careful handling, quietly, for later. It was the shoulder. The way Simone had rolled her left shoulder when she thought nobody was watching. That specific movement, that exact angle, the private physical grammar of a person managing pain they had decided was no longer worth mentioning to anyone because mentioning it had never changed anything. He had seen it once before, in a different city, in a different light, on a night that had never fully left him regardless of how many other nights he had stacked on top of it in the years since, 12 years ago. A night so wet the rain felt personal, the kind that didn't fall so much as press, that found the gap between your collar and your neck and settled there like it had been looking for exactly that place specifically. He had been 26. Arrogant in the way only young men who have never truly lost anything are arrogant completely, comfortably, without any awareness that the comfort itself was the problem. He had built enough by 26 to believe he had accounted for every variable. He walked into rooms like he had already read the ending. He made decisions the way other men made statements, with the full expectation that the world would arrange itself accordingly. He had walked into a meeting he shouldn't have walked into alone. He paid for it 3 blocks away in an alley behind a restaurant that smelled like grease and garlic and the particular sourness of kitchen waste that had been sitting too long in warm air. 2 broken ribs he didn't know were broken yet. A cut above his right eye that had bled through his shirt and was still bleeding in the slow, persistent way that meant it needed more than pressure. His phone destroyed. His pride in pieces he was too trained to show and too experienced to examine while he was still in the field. He made it to the gap between the dumpster and the back wall and stayed there, still, breathing carefully, each inhale measured, each exhale controlled. Not because he was calm, but because calm was the only tool he had left. And he was not a man who discarded tools simply because the situation was difficult. He heard them pass twice, close enough the second time that he stopped breathing entirely for 11 seconds. He counted. Counting gave the mind something to do besides panic, and panic was expensive, and he could not afford expensive right now. The footsteps faded. Then the kitchen door opened. He went rigid, calculated the distance between his current position and the far end of the alley, decided he couldn't make it quietly with the ribs, stayed still, stayed completely still, and pressed himself further into the gap and waited. A voice. Young. Female. Cautious, but not afraid. There was a difference, and he registered it immediately, even through the pain and the rain, and the 11 seconds of held breath, still unwinding in his chest. Hey, he didn't answer. Hey, are you okay? Still nothing. I can see your shoes. I'm not going to say anything. Are you okay? He looked up. She was standing at the kitchen door holding a large bag of waste in her right hand. Black apron, gray shirt beneath it, damp at the collar from kitchen steam, hair pulled back tight. She was looking at him with an expression that contained neither the fear he expected nor the pity he would have resented. Just assessment. Clear, rapid, unsentimental. The look of someone for whom quick decisions were not exceptional but routine. Someone who had learned that hesitation in small moments had consequences in large ones. She assessed him for approximately 3 seconds. Then she made her decision. She set the bag down beside the door, looked back into the kitchen through the small window beside the handle, looked back at him. Stay down. Don't move. I'll tell you when it's clear. She went back inside. She came back out 12 minutes later. Pretended to bring another bag. Checked both ends of the alley without making it obvious she was checking. Gave him a single small nod that meant not yet, and went back in. She came out again 9 minutes after that. Same routine. Same check. This time the nod meant something different. He read it correctly. The third time she came out, she crouched down beside him, close enough that he could see she was younger than he'd initially registered, mid-20s. The particular tiredness around her eyes that didn't come from a single long shift, but from many long shifts accumulated over a long time. They're gone. There's a pharmacy 2 blocks north. Pay cash. Don't use the emergency room tonight. He looked at her directly for the first time. Why are you helping me? She considered the question seriously, like it deserved a real answer rather than a deflection. Then she shrugged. Her left shoulder. That specific movement. That exact angle. Because you needed it. No leverage. No calculation. No expectation of anything in return. Just a young woman in a wet alley making a decision about a bleeding stranger based on nothing except the simple and apparently sufficient fact that he was there and he needed help and she was capable of providing it. He pressed money into her hand before he stood. More than the moment required. Far more. She tried to return it, and he closed her fingers around it firmly and walked north without looking back, because looking back was not something he permitted himself in the field, regardless of how much he wanted to. He looked for her afterward, quietly, methodically, the way he did everything. He had people check the restaurant's employment records, had the neighborhood canvassed discreetly, had her description circulated among people who noticed things professionally. She had moved within the month, changed neighborhoods twice in the following year. The city had swallowed her the way cities swallowed people who were always one step ahead of something difficult, completely, efficiently, without leaving a forwarding address. He had never stopped looking. He had never stopped owing. He came back to the bistro in layers. The sound first, forks on ceramic. Low music from a speaker near the bar. Sterling laughing at something on his phone. Then the weight of the room. His lieutenant, watching him from the left with the careful stillness of a man who had learned that certain expressions on certain faces required witness, but not interruption. Two bodyguards who had straightened slightly without knowing why, responding to something in Jae-hyun's posture that had shifted during the 30 seconds he had been somewhere else entirely. He looked across the bistro floor. Simone was at the far table collecting empty glasses, reaching across for one that was slightly too far, and there it was. The left shoulder rolling forward. The same movement. The same angle. The same private physical grammar he had seen once in a wet alley 12 years ago on a night that had never fully left him. He looked at her for a long time. 12 years. 2 cities. One daughter, who counted half years and drew stars on double shift days and walked through 7 armed men with a folded piece of paper and complete unshakable faith that telling the truth to the right person would be enough. He picked up his phone, typed to Park, "Come in now." Then he looked at Sterling one final time, spinning his keys, laughing, completely unbothered. A man who had never once sat in a wet alley and understood what it meant to need something and have a stranger decide without hesitation that your need was sufficient reason to help. He understood something then that he hadn't understood in 12 years of looking. He hadn't found Simone. Simone's daughter had found him. There was a difference, and it was the most important difference in the room. Park materialized at the edge of Jae-hyun's table, the way a shadow materialized when the light shifted. One moment the chair beside Jae-hyun's left hand was empty. The next moment Park was in it, and nobody in the bistro could have identified the exact instant the transition occurred. He was small, unremarkable in the specific way that required effort to achieve the kind of face that security cameras captured and investigators later described as average. The kind of build that crowds absorbed without registering. The kind of stillness that read as nothing to notice, rather than everything to notice, which was precisely what it was. He had worked for Jae-hyun for 9 years. In 9 years, he had never raised his voice, never arrived late, never once required a second instruction. He set a slim tablet and a leather folder on the table, said nothing. Jae-hyun was watching Sterling. Sterling had moved from the bar to the floor, doing his version of managing, which involved walking slowly between tables with his hands in his pockets, looking at things without actually seeing them, occasionally stopping to say something to a customer that made the customer smile out of social obligation rather than genuine warmth. He had the practiced performance of a man who had learned early that the appearance of engagement was sufficient substitute for the real thing in most situations. He hadn't looked at Simone in 4 minutes. Simone was at the far counter loading a tray. Her movements had slowed slightly in the last hour, not dramatically, not enough that a casual observer would notice. But Jae-hyun had been watching her long enough that the baseline was established, and the deviation from it was visible. Her left hand stayed closer to the tray than it needed to. Her right shoulder carried slightly more of the weight than it should. The shift was ending, the way long shifts ended for people who had been doing this too long, without adequate rest or food, or the basic dignity of being paid what they were owed. She lifted the tray, started toward her table, and then Sterling turned. He saw her from across the bistro, and his face arranged itself into the expression Jae-hyun had been watching it arrange itself into all afternoon. The expression that came before his voice. "Simone." She stopped, turned. Still holding the full tray, "That table asked for their order 20 minutes ago." He said it across the bistro floor. Not quietly, not privately. In the hearing of 4 surrounding tables, the kitchen staff visible through the pass, every person in the immediate vicinity, who now turned their attention to a woman, standing with a heavy tray, trying to decide what expression was safest to wear while being spoken to this way in public. "I know," she said. "I have it right here. I'm bringing it now. 20 minutes. He said it again like repetition was a form of precision rather than cruelty. "That's not acceptable. I had 3 tables simultaneously. The kitchen was backed up on 2 of the orders and I was waiting on—" "I don't need the explanation, Simone. I need the standard." He put his hands back in his pockets. 20 minutes is not the standard. He turned away from her before she could respond. The dismissal was the point. The turning away. The ending of the exchange on his terms before she could finish her sentence. Not because he had made his point effectively, but because making her swallow an unfinished sentence in front of an audience was the point, had always been the point. The wages were one thing. This was another. This was daily. This was what 11 weeks actually looked like from the inside, when you stripped away the accounting and looked at the human texture of it. Simone turned back toward her table. Her shoulders didn't drop. She didn't let them. Jaehyun stood up, not quickly, not with any visible urgency or drama. He simply stood the way a structure simply stood, present and permanent and occupying space with a completeness that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with nature. One moment he was seated, and the next he was on his feet, and the table knew it, and the immediate vicinity knew it, and the room began to know it, in the spreading way that rooms registered the movement of certain people not from noise or gesture but from some atmospheric shift that arrived slightly ahead of the physical fact. Park stood simultaneously, folder under one arm, tablet in hand, already moving to position without being told, because in 9 years he had learned to read Jaehyun's intentions from the angle of his shoulders. His lieutenant moved to his right. 2 bodyguards repositioned toward the door naturally, casually, and one moved to the end of the bar, and one to the kitchen entrance. And suddenly, every exit in the bistro had a quiet, unremarkable, completely immovable presence beside it. Sterling didn't notice any of it. Jaehyun crossed the bistro floor, unhurried, hands relaxed at his sides, expression neutral, in the specific way that had nothing to do with blankness, and everything to do with control. The face of a man who had decided what was going to happen, and was now simply moving through the steps required to make it happen, and found the process neither exciting nor troubling, but simply necessary. Simone had set the tray down at her table, and was arranging the plates when she registered someone standing behind her. She turned. She looked at him. Her expression moved through several things, quickly surprise at the proximity, the automatic professional composure that kicked in before she'd finished processing the surprise, and then beneath both of those, something else. Something uncertain and searching. The feeling of a face that didn't fit any category she had ready. She didn't know him, but something in her didn't quite believe that. Jaehyun looked at her for just a moment. One private, unguarded second that his lieutenants would spend a long time afterward trying to name, and then he looked past her, at Sterling, who had finally noticed him, who was standing near the host, stand with his hands still in his pockets, and his expression cycling through surprise and irritation and the beginning of dismissal. The standard sequence of a man who had never been interrupted in his own establishment by someone he didn't recognize. Jaehyun spoke, quietly, conversationally. The kind of quiet that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the specific weight of a voice that had never needed to be loud to be heard. "Stay away from my business partner." Sterling blinked. Simone turned slightly. "Excuse me? You heard me. I don't know who you think you—" "I know exactly who I am," Jaehyun said. "The question is whether you know who you're speaking to." Sterling looked him over. The expensive shirt, the rings, the ink visible at his collar and cuffs. He was running his assessment threat level filtered entirely through the narrow lens of social category, wealth signaling, perceived status, and arriving at a conclusion that felt correct to him, because every conclusion Sterling had ever arrived at had felt correct to him. He decided wrong. "This is a private conversation between me and my employee," Sterling said, drawing himself up slightly. "So I'd suggest you return to your table." "She's not your employee," Jaehyun said simply. "An employee gets paid." The bistro went quiet. 4 surrounding tables. Glasses held halfway to mouths. Forks paused mid-air. The specific suspended animation of people who understood they were witnessing something that could not be unwatched, and were making rapid internal calculations about whether to pretend otherwise. "I don't know what she's been telling people, but whatever she said—" 11 weeks, Jaehyun said. Sterling stopped. 11 weeks. $430 in withheld overtime. 30 cents from a Sunday shift she worked in full. Jaehyun tilted his head slightly. "And a Porsche purchased yesterday while her electricity was disconnected." The color moved in Sterling's face, not leaving rearranging, finding new configurations. "Who are you?" he said. Quieter now. The dismissal gone. Something more careful in its place. Jaehyun looked at him for a long moment. Then he said one word. "Park." Park materialized at his shoulder with the tablet and the leather folder and the quiet, devastating efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this cue, for exactly this long. Jaehyun looked at Simone. She was standing very still, her hand pressed flat against her sternum, her eyes bright with something that had no clean name, not quite relief, not quite fear, not quite recognition, something that contained elements of all three, and resolved into none of them completely. "I apologize for the interruption," Jaehyun said to her quietly. Genuinely. Like the interruption was the only thing in this situation that required an apology. This won't take long. He turned back to Sterling. Shall we sit down? It wasn't a question. Sterling sat down because his legs made the decision before his pride could argue. He took the chair across from Jaehyun, with the careful movements of a man trying to reassemble his composure in real time, pulling it around himself like a jacket he'd dropped, trying to make the act of picking it up look intentional rather than desperate. He straightened in his seat, adjusted his watch, set his hands flat on the table in front of him, and then moved them to his lap, and then brought them back to the table because there was no position that felt natural anymore, and every position announced that fact. Jaehyun sat across from him. Park stood to the right, tablet open, leather folder on the table, hands clasped with the serene patience of a man who had done this before, and found both the doing and the waiting equally unremarkable. He looked at nothing specific. He missed nothing. Sterling looked around once, the instinct of a man locating exits, measuring distances, calculating options, and found the room had rearranged itself in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The man at the end of the bar who hadn't ordered anything in 40 minutes. The two near the front door who were facing inward instead of out. The one beside the kitchen entrance with his hands folded. The one near the window who had been nursing the same coffee since before Sterling arrived that morning. He looked back at Jaehyun. I don't know what she's been telling people. Sterling started, finding his voice and arranging it into the register he used when he needed to sound reasonable while maneuvering. But whatever she said, there are two sides to every— Open it, Jaehyun said. Park opened the leather folder, turned it to face Sterling with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who had made this exact gesture many times and found it neither dramatic nor routine, but simply correct. Sterling looked down. His own face looked back at him. Passport photo clipped to the top left corner of a document that was considerably thicker than it had any right to be. His full name. Date of birth. The kind of comprehensive opening that told you immediately this wasn't a surface search. This was the kind of file that took infrastructure to build. 3 addresses listed in order: the tax. One first, then the real one, then the third property registered under the company name, and beside it, in small, precise type, the name of the woman who had signed the registration document, her current address, 400 miles away, and her phone number. Sterling's throat closed slightly. Where did you— Second page, Jaehyun said. Sterling turned the page with a hand that had developed a slight tremor he was working hard to suppress. Business financials, 12 months of them. Laid out in columns so clean they looked clinical. The kind of document that didn't come from public records but from someone who had been inside the actual accounts. Revenue on the left, declared expenses on the right. And between them, a third column that shouldn't have existed, highlighted in a color that felt accusatory before he even read the numbers it contained. The gap. The space between what the bistro actually generated and what Sterling reported to the relevant authorities. Itemized, dated, cross-referenced with bank records he had kept in an account he had been confident was sufficiently obscured. It was not a small gap. Those are proprietary financial records. You can't have access to— Third page, Jaehyun said. Sterling turned it. The gambling ledger. His gambling ledger. The offshore account accessed through a proxy service he had paid a significant and recurring fee to believe was genuinely untraceable. 3 years of entries. Every loss itemized with the particular clarity of records kept by people who intended to collect on them eventually. The balance at the bottom was circled in red. Sterling stared at the circled number. He knew what it meant. He had known for 3 months, and had been managing that knowledge by placing it in a compartment, closing the compartment firmly, and directing his attention elsewhere, until it forced itself open again. The compartment was open now. The men you owe that balance to? Jaehyun said quietly, unhurried, conversational, as though discussing something mild and administrative, sent a representative to this bistro 7 weeks ago to discuss a payment arrangement. He paused. You told him next week. Sterling said nothing. Sound familiar? Sterling's jaw moved. No words came out. They have been patient, Jaehyun continued. Professionally patient. The kind of patience that has a structure to it, a schedule, a billing cycle, a point at which it ends and something else begins. He glanced at Park. That point was yesterday, Park said. First words he had spoken at this table, delivered with the flat precision of a man reading a fact from a document, rather than offering an opinion. Sterling set his hands flat on the table. They were not steady. What do you want? He said. Not a question. The punctuation of a man who had already begun calculating the cost of whatever came next. Money, Sterling said, leaning slightly forward, finding the last available vein of the confidence that had carried him through 43 years of consequences that always, until now, arrived at a manageable scale. Whatever they're paying you, whatever she's paying you, I'll match it. Right now. Cash. Tonight. You walk out of here, we forget this conversation happened, and I handle the situation with my employee myself. Properly. Full payment. Done by the end of the week. Jaehyun looked at him. I'll double it, Sterling said. The bistro noise continued around them. Completely ordinary sounds wrapping something that was not ordinary at all. You just offered to bribe me, Jaehyun said. I offered to make this simple. In front of 2 of my associates, Jaehyun said. And in a dining room with 14 other customers. None of whom have left. Sterling's certainty flickered. He looked around at the surrounding tables, at the faces that were not quite looking at him but not quite not looking either. At the man at the bar. At the 2 near the door. The flicker became something larger. Here is what happens now, Jaehyun said. Still quiet. Still completely still. You don't get to negotiate. You don't get to counteroffer. You don't get to reframe this as a business conversation between equals. He held Sterling's gaze across the table without effort, without performance, without any of the theatrical weight that lesser men used as substitute for actual authority. We are not equals. We have never been equals. The only reason you believed otherwise is that nobody has ever sat across from you and told you the truth. He let that land completely before continuing. I'm telling you now. Sterling stared at him. All the air had left him. Not quickly, slowly, the way pressure left a structure when something load-bearing gave way. The composure he had been reassembling since he sat down stopped reassembling. He sat very still. 4th page, Park said quietly. Sterling turned it. A single printed document. Clean. Spare. The wage log, Simone's handwriting, 11 weeks of dates and hours. The stars Royale had drawn on the double shift days reproduced at the top. Below it 3 short paragraphs and 2 signature lines. The language was precise and unambiguous, written by someone who understood exactly which words were load-bearing and had made sure every one of them was. Sterling read it. Read it again. Set it down. This transfers everything, he said. His voice had lost its register entirely. Flat now. The voice of a man speaking from somewhere below the place where performance lived. The lease. The equipment. The licensing. Everything. Yes, Jaehyun said. For $1. $1. Sterling shook his head slowly. Any lawyer would tear this apart. Any court would. Read the 2nd paragraph again, Jaehyun said. Sterling read it. The 2nd paragraph outlined in the same clean, precise language as everything else the exact amount Sterling owed to the men with the offshore ledger. The exact location of the cash safe behind the dry storage unit in the kitchen. The name of the councilman. The name of the labor board contact. And a single sentence at the bottom that required no elaboration and received none. All relevant parties have been made aware of the contents of this document and are awaiting confirmation of tonight's outcome. Sterling looked up. You told them, he said. I told them you were ready to have a productive conversation, Jaehyun said. Whether that conversation is productive depends entirely on what you do in the next 60 seconds. Park produced a pen from his jacket pocket, set it on the table, slid it across to Sterling. And Jaehyun waited completely, genuinely, unhurriedly, the way a man waited when he already knew the outcome and was simply allowing the other person the dignity of arriving at it themselves. Sterling looked at the pen, at the document beneath it, at his own passport photo watching him from the first page. He picked up the pen. His hand shook. He signed anyway. Some doors, once closed, do not reopen. Sterling had just heard this one lock. The pen came down hard at the end of the signature. Not intentionally or perhaps intentionally, the last available expression of resistance in a body that had run out of every other kind. He dropped the pen on the table, leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling, the posture of a man absorbing a loss whose full dimensions he couldn't yet calculate, staring upward the way people stared upward when the thing in front of them was too large to look at directly. Park collected the signed document immediately, produced a second copy from the folder, identical in every detail, already prepared, already anticipated, and set it in front of Sterling. Yours, Park said. Sterling didn't touch it. Jaehyun reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a single bill. Set it on the table in front of Sterling. Crisp. Centered. $1. Your payment, Jaehyun said. The bistro is sold. The transaction is complete. Sterling looked at the bill for a long time. Long enough that the looking became something, the particular hollowed-out stillness of a man sitting inside the first moment of a life that had just become irrevocably smaller. The Porsche was in the parking structure 2 blocks away. The watch was on his wrist. Everything else, the lease, the equipment, the liquor license, the health certification, the relationship with the morning produce supplier he had cultivated over 6 years. Everything else was on the other side of the signature he had just put on a document he hadn't chosen to sign. He did not pick up the dollar. Jae-hyun stood, straightened his jacket, one precise downward pull at the hem. Then he looked across the bistro floor. Simone was at the counter. She had been there since he stood up, not working, not pretending to work, just standing with one hand pressed flat against the surface and her eyes not quite focused on anything in the middle distance. The hand on the counter was the thing. The way it pressed down, not for balance, not from fatigue, but from the specific need to feel something solid and fixed in a moment when the ground had become uncertain. He had seen people stand like that before, at the edge of things, at the moment before the next thing arrived, and they had to find out whether they were strong enough for it. She was strong enough for it. He already knew that. "Simone," he said. The same quiet weight as always. Not loud, not soft. Simply present in the room the way he was always present in rooms. She looked up. He looked at Sterling, still in his chair, still looking at the $1 bill. "Give her what's in your pocket," Jae-hyun said. Something crossed Sterling's face, a last contraction of the pride that had been deflating steadily for the last 20 minutes. "That's my—" "It was never yours," Jae-hyun said, not sharply, simply as a statement of fact that had been true before tonight and would remain true after it. "You earned it on her time, her hours, her body carrying trays on a left side that hasn't been right in years while you stood at a host stand and counted it." Sterling held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he reached into his breast pocket. The stack of hundreds came out slowly. He set it on the table without looking at Simone, the particular quality of a man surrendering something in front of an audience he couldn't afford to have witnessed the surrendering. But the audience was there and the surrendering happened anyway, and Sterling sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling again, and that was the end of whatever remained of his evening. Jae-hyun picked up the stack. He didn't count it. Didn't weigh it in his palm or perform any of the gestures that would have made the moment about the money rather than what the money represented. He looked at Royale instead. She had appeared silently from somewhere near the kitchen hallway and was standing at the edge of the scene with her hands clasped in front of her, not twisting the hem of her shirt anymore. Hands clasped. Still. Watching with those quiet, precise eyes that had walked through 7 bodyguards, as though they were simply furniture arranged inconveniently in her path. He held the stack out toward her. Royale looked at it, looked at him. "That's not mine. You came to this table with evidence," he said. "You presented your case clearly. You identified the problem, located the correct person to bring it to, and argued on behalf of your client without being dismissed, without being frightened, and without once saying anything that wasn't true." He kept his hand extended. "In my world, that work has a name, and the name is consulting, and consulting has a fee." Royale considered this seriously, the way she considered everything fully, without rushing, with the particular gravity of a person who respected the process of thinking enough to complete it before speaking. She looked at her mother. Simone was still at the counter, her hand still pressed flat against the surface, her eyes bright in the way that had nothing to do with happiness, and everything to do with the specific, overwhelming quality of relief when it arrived after being held off long enough that you had begun to quietly restructure your life around its absence. She gave Royale the smallest nod. Royale walked forward. She took the stack with both hands carefully, the way she had carried the wage log, and held it against her chest for a moment. "Thank you," she said to Jae-hyun. He looked at her for a long moment. "Don't thank me," he said. "You did the work." She thought about this. "I'm going to give most of it to my mom." "I know," he said. She looked up at him, 4.5 years old, serious and certain, and completely unintimidated by anything in this room or anything that had happened in it today. "Are you going to stay?" He held her gaze. "No," he said. She accepted this without argument. The way she accepted everything directly, without the negotiation that adults use to soften the edges of facts they found difficult. She simply received it and incorporated it, and moved on to what came next. What came next was Jae-hyun turning to Simone. He crossed the bistro floor toward the counter unhurried, the way he had crossed it in the other direction an hour ago, and stopped in front of her. She straightened slightly, not from formality, from the instinct of a person who had spent 11 weeks making herself as composed as possible in spaces where her composure was the only thing she controlled. He reached into his jacket, removed something small, set it on the counter between them, a key. Ordinary in every visible respect. The kind of key that could open 1,000 doors in 1,000 buildings across this city. Except that this one had a small tag attached, a white rectangular tag, and on the back, in small precise handwriting, 2 words. "Front door." He left the key on the counter, looked at her. "It's yours now," he said quietly. Simone looked at the key for a long time. It sat on the counter between them, small, unremarkable. The kind of object that existed in pockets and drawers all over the city without meaning anything beyond its function. But this one was different, and they both understood it was different, and neither of them said so, Because some things lost something essential when you tried to put language around them before they were ready. Her hand moved toward it, stopped just before touching it. Then she said something he didn't expect. "I used to practice," she said quietly. Jaehyun waited. She looked at the bistro walls, the warm brick, the low-hanging lights, the tables she had wiped down 10,000 times, the counter she had stood behind, and in front of, and on the wrong side of, for every hour of every shift, since the first day she walked in here needing work, and found Sterling willing to offer it. She looked at all of it the way a person looked at something they had memorized without intending to. "When Royale was a baby," she said, "when she couldn't sleep, I used to walk her around in the middle of the night, 3, 4 in the morning, both of us awake, the whole city quiet outside the window." She paused. "I used to pretend. Whatever kitchen I was working in at the time, I used to walk her around and pretend it was mine." She touched the edge of the counter lightly with 2 fingers. "Not the key, the counter. I used to whisper to her. I'd say one day we'll have somewhere that's ours, somewhere with our name on the door, somewhere nobody can tell us to leave." She stopped. "I stopped doing that," she said. "At some point, I just stopped. I decided it was wasteful, wanting things that weren't built for people like me." She shook her head slightly. "I told myself I was being practical, being realistic. I told myself Royale was too young to remember any of it anyway." She looked across the bistro floor. Royale was near the far wall, standing with the stack of hundreds still held against her chest, watching her mother with those quiet, serious eyes, patient and still, as she always was when she was waiting for something she had already decided was going to happen. "She remembered," Simone said, almost to herself. "She was 18 months old, and I was whispering to her at 4 in the morning in a kitchen that wasn't mine, and she remembered every word." She looked back at the counter. "She came to you because I stopped believing it was possible, and she refused to stop." A pause. "She's been carrying it for both of us." Jaehyun was quiet for a moment. "You had a job," he said. 12 years ago. On the east side. A restaurant. You worked the closing shift most nights." Simone's brow drew together. "The kitchen closed at 11, he said. "But you stayed later. Most nights until midnight. Sometimes past it." Her expression began to shift. Slowly. The way light changed in a room, when something outside moved gradual, and then suddenly complete. "You took your break at 9:30, he continued. "Behind the building. There was a gap between the back wall and the dumpster." Simone's hand came up to her mouth. "It was raining," Jaehyun said. The composure she had maintained through 11 weeks of unpaid wages, through Sterling's voice cutting across rooms at her, through the tray that lurched, through the 8 minutes that were apparently embarrassing, all of it moved at once behind her eyes, not breaking, not collapsing, but shifting, like weight redistributed across a surface that had been holding too much for too long and had finally been given permission to adjust. She didn't cry. She was too disciplined for that and too private and too aware that this room still had customers in it. But her eyes went bright and her jaw tightened, and she breathed once through her nose carefully, the same way she did everything, and then she looked at him, really looked at him. 12 years collapsing in the space between 1 second and the next. "That was you," she said. "That was me." She shook her head, small and slow, trying to reconcile the bleeding man she had crouched beside in a wet alley with the one standing in front of her now expensive shirt, rings on his hands, 7 bodyguards distributed around a bistro he had just transferred into her name. "I thought about you," she said. "Afterward. For years. I didn't know if you made it. I didn't know who you were, or where you went, or whether the pharmacy was enough." She stopped. "I prayed for a stranger for 3 years. "I know," he said quietly. "I owed you more than a prayer back. I looked for you," he said. "After that night, you'd moved. I moved a lot back then." Something crossed her face, brief and private. "Less distance now, just the same circles." "I know that too." She absorbed this, the shape of what it meant that he had looked and kept looking, and known the outlines of her movement through this city across 12 years. Another person might have found it unsettling. Simone looked at it directly and found something in it that wasn't unsettling at all. "Royale was right," she said. The almost smile arrived briefly, real, unguarded, gone before she decided whether it was appropriate. "She told me this morning before we left the apartment. She said she was going to find someone today who could fix it." She looked at her daughter across the bistro. "I told her that wasn't how things worked. I told her to stay close and not bother anyone." A pause. She nodded. "I thought she understood." "She understood," Jaehyun said. "She just disagreed." Simone looked at him, then she laughed. Small and brief, and surprised even her arriving before she could anticipate it. which was perhaps the only way it could have arrived given what kind of day this had been and what kind of woman she was. Completely real. The kind of laugh that came from somewhere below the level of decision-making. It faded. She looked at the key. "I don't know how to run a bistro," she said. "You've been running this one," he said. Sterling just had his name on the door. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not the same thing." "No," he said. "It isn't. But you know this kitchen. You know these suppliers. You know which tables get the afternoon light, and which ones need an extra candle, and you know the loose tile by the kitchen entrance that catches heels, and the chair at table 9 that sticks." He held her gaze. "You know everything about this place except that it belongs to you. Tonight that changes." She looked at the key for a long time. Then she reached out and picked it up. Closed her fingers around it slowly, completely, the way you closed your hand around something you intended to keep. Jaehyun nodded once. He turned from the counter. Park was already at the door folder under his arm, oriented toward the exit with the patient readiness of a man who understood that his work here was complete. His lieutenants were on their feet, his bodyguards already moving smoothly, naturally, the choreography of practiced exits that left no visible trace of organization. Then Royale was in front of him. She had crossed the bistro floor without anyone marking the moment again, for the third time today, materializing between 1 second and the next, in the way that was apparently simply how she moved through spaces, and was standing directly in his path. Hands clasped, the stack of hundreds still held against her chest. She looked up at him. "Will we see you again?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, at the red hoodie, at the hair in 2 puffs with the red ribbon, at the eyes that had looked at him this afternoon like he was a monument, and were looking at him now like he was something else. Something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary available to 4.5-year-olds, but that she was filing away carefully for later, the way she filed everything. He crouched down, slowly, until he was at her eye level. The most dangerous man in 4 districts on one knee in a bistro that now belonged to her mother, looking at a child who had walked through 7 armed men with a folded piece of paper and changed the shape of an evening. He reached out and straightened the ribbon in her hair, just once, just slightly. The smallest possible gesture performed with the same precision he brought to everything. Then he stood. "You won't see me," he said quietly. "But you'll never be in the dark again." He walked back to the counter and set a small card face down in front of Simone, without breaking stride. "If anyone gives you trouble," he said. "Anyone at all." She looked at the card, but didn't turn it over yet. He walked toward the door and out. The door closed behind him. Quiet. Final. The specific sound of something ending completely. Simone stood at the counter with the key in one hand. After a long moment, she turned the card over. No name. Just a number. And below it, in small, precise handwriting, 3 words. "For the light." She read it twice. Then she closed her hand around that too. The car was waiting exactly where he had left it. Black. Unmarked. Idling quietly at the curb with the particular stillness of something that had been there long enough to become part of the street. The driver didn't turn around when Jaehyun got in. Didn't ask how it went. He had been driving Jaehyun for 11 years, and had learned in the first month that questions after jobs were not part of the arrangement. Jaehyun settled into the seat. He didn't reach for his phone. He allowed himself this first minute the way he allowed himself very little without justification, without productivity, without it being in service of anything beyond itself. He looked out the window. The bistro was visible from here. Warm light through the front glass, the shapes of people moving inside, customers finishing meals, a staff member clearing a table near the window, and there, at the counter, a woman standing with something in each hand, and her daughter beside her, the daughter still holding something against her chest. Both of them still and close in the particular way of people who have just survived something together, and haven't yet found the words for it, and have decided, at least for this moment, that words are not required. The sign above the door still read Sterling's. Weather-faded lettering. The kind of sign that had been there long enough to look permanent. It wouldn't look permanent tomorrow. He had arranged it already, a brief message to a contact who handled this kind of work quickly and without questions. A man in a gray van already parked 2 streets over, waiting until the bistro's last customer left before beginning. Kim was in the front passenger seat. 15 years. The only person in Jaehyun's organization who had ever addressed him with a direct personal question and remained employed afterward. Kim waited until the car pulled away from the curb. Then he waited another half block. "Ask it," Jaehyun said. Kim turned slightly in his seat. "Why didn't you tell her? What you've been doing? How long?" The city moved past the window. Evening had settled into full dark, the streetlights doing their work, the lit windows of apartments and offices passing in the rhythm of movement through a city that had been going about its business all day, entirely indifferent to what had occurred in one bistro on one block during one evening that would not make any news, and would not appear in any record, and would be known, fully, only by the people who were in the room when it happened. She didn't need to know, Jaehyun said. Kim was quiet for a moment. She might have wanted to. Wanting and needing are different things. A pause. She needed the bistro. She needed Sterling removed completely and permanently, and without the possibility of return or retaliation. She needed her daughter safe, and her wages recovered, and a door with her name behind it. He looked at his hand, the rings, the lighter resting against his palm. She didn't need to know that the man sitting across from her tonight is the reason no one else ever tried to hurt her before tonight. Kim absorbed this. Waited to see if more was coming. More came. I found her the second time 8 years ago, Jaehyun said. Different neighborhood, different job. Same situation, landlord moving against her, employer underpaying her, no one in her corner, and no obvious recourse. I couldn't intervene directly. There was too much attention on the syndicate that year. He watched a traffic light change outside the window, so I bought the block instead. Kim turned further in his seat. The bistro sits on a block I have owned for 8 years, Jaehyun said. Through a property holding company that traces through 4 jurisdictions before it reaches anything with my name adjacent to it. I set the protection rate for that block myself high enough to discourage interest from every other syndicate in this city, low enough that Sterling could absorb it without it appearing notable in his financials. He paused. He paid it every month for 8 years, believing he was paying an anonymous third party for the standard arrangement. He was paying me to leave her alone. Kim stared at him. 8 years, Kim said. 8 years. You've been paying protection money to yourself, to ensure no one else collected it, Jaehyun said. And no one else came near that block. And no one else had any reason to look at that bistro, or the woman working in it. He looked out the window. It worked. For 8 years it worked. Sterling was the only problem, and Sterling was a problem I could manage from a distance, until I couldn't. The wages were the threshold. When he crossed 11 weeks, I knew the distance was finished. Kim was quiet for a long time. The car moved through the city. Block after block of ordinary evening people walking. Restaurants lit. The ordinary, beautiful, indifferent machinery of a city that contained, within its 10,000 simultaneous stories, one woman standing at a counter with a key in her hand, and her daughter beside her, and a card face up on the counter with 3 words on it. The sign, Kim said finally. What will it say? Jaehyun had decided this 8 years ago. On the day he bought the block. On the day he saw her name on a lease inquiry for a building in a neighborhood he already controlled, and understood that the city hadn't swallowed her after all. It had simply been keeping her somewhere within reach while he finished the work of making it safe to find her. Royale's place, he said. Kim nodded once. Slowly. The nod of a man for whom the answer was simultaneously surprising and the only answer that made sense. They drove in silence for another block. Then Kim said, The card you left her. She'll call eventually. Eventually, Jaehyun agreed. What will you tell her? Jaehyun thought about a wet alley 12 years ago. A woman who had crouched beside a bleeding stranger in the rain and made a decision in 3 seconds, based on nothing more elaborate than the simple fact that he needed help and she was capable of providing it. He thought about a 4.5-year-old girl who had walked through 7 armed men with a folded piece of paper and complete unshakable faith that telling the truth to the right person would be sufficient. He thought about a woman whispering to a baby at 4 a.m. in someone else's kitchen. One day we'll have somewhere that's ours. He looked out the window at the city moving past. At the lit windows. At the street they were on now 4 blocks from an apartment where a child had lain awake listening to her mother say a name in the dark. The truth, he said quietly, when she's ready to hear it. Kim didn't ask what the truth was. He already understood. The car moved on. Behind them, on a block that had been quietly protected for 8 years by a man whose name had never appeared on a single document connected to it. A gray van turned the corner and parked carefully in front of a bistro whose last customer had just left. The driver got out, opened the back, began assembling the equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this work often, and took a quiet, professional satisfaction in the doing of it. He worked without hurry. The night was clear. The block was quiet. The bistro light was still on inside a woman and her daughter moving around in there, the daughter directing the rearrangement of something near the far wall, the woman following the direction with the particular expression of a person who found it easier to trust a 4-year-old's vision than to argue with it. The old letters came down first. Then the new ones went up one at a time, each one level, each one spaced correctly, each one placed with the care of someone who understood that the thing being made here was not just a sign but a declaration, a name on a door, a somewhere that was theirs. He finished as the bistro light went off inside. Stepped back, looked at it. It read, Royale's Place. Est. Tonight. He got back in the van, drove away. The block went quiet. The sign stayed.